talk,
identity,
and access
management.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff, how's it going?
I'm pretty good. Yourself?
Good. It was actually one of those days where I was able to catch up on all of my webinars. So I've been watching webinars all day, or I shouldn't say all day, but I got to see one on e-voting, another on DevSecOps, and I got to rewatch the webinar from our esteemed guest today.
Yeah, we have a guest today. His name is Vittorio Bertocci. He's a principal architect at Auth0. If you have been to an identity conference in the last, 15 years or so, and you've seen this amazing just mane of hair striding down the hallways and with a gaggle of people just hemming and hawing and following him, then you've seen him. You can't miss it. He has the best hair in IAM, hands down. And we want to welcome him to the show. Welcome, Vittorio.
Thanks, Jeff and Jim, for having me for the fantastic introduction.
Well, it's totally well deserved. And today, we're going to have a couple different topics, I think. And you gave a recently an Identiverse presentation on tracking, which is what we're going to get to. And I know that you guys are working on a podcast as well on the Auth0 side that's going to be coming out soon. It's called Identity Unlocked. So we want to do a little bit of a cross promotion there, try to help them get that out. And we'll have a link to that in our show notes as well. So we're going to talk about the podcast a little bit later, and we'll get into browser tracking and how that's affecting identity. But one of the first things that we always like to ask our guests is how they got into identity and access management, and maybe you can sum that up for us.
I'm ready to bet that 70-80% of your guests answer the same way I'm answering, by accident. I was poised to be a scientific visualization person. I majored in my master in computer science in computational geometry, which has absolutely nothing to do with identity. And I started in visualization, but then the 2000.com boost happened. And so I had to quickly find employment because my firm for scientific visualization was floundering, and I was stranded in Milan, far away from my little fishing town where I was born. And Microsoft was hiring, so I hopped in the Microsoft battleship. And there they didn't do much visualization in 2001, but they were doing productivity. So I ended up in this project in which I was working with IBM, and we had to interoperate. It was like early 2000s. And back in the day, WS star and those protocols were all the rage, and SAML token formats and similar. And so what happened was that the customer wanted to use a product that was in beta and that supported the SAML token format. And then when the product went GA, they dropped the support for SAML. But we sold the solution to the customer. So as a consultant, I just rolled my sleeves and wrote a SAML implementation from scratch. And so what happened is that in the Italian subsidiary, I became the identity guy. So people would come and ask me questions and I'd have no idea. But I would just hit Google because I didn't want to disappoint them. And I would learn the answer and give it to them. And so basically I became a self-fulfilling prophecy, and I became the identity guy because I learned. And then Redmond had an opening for someone with that particular experience, like hands-on experience, which wasn't very common back in the day, again, 2005. And so they offered me a position there. So I said, well, let's try. I'm told that America is fun. So I moved to the States, and it turned out that it was absolutely fantastic. Like I worked there for a good 17 years, and I focused on identity and developers in particular, this special intersection that back in the day didn't get a lot of attention. Now it's way better. And so I worked first in evangelism, I wrote books, I did conferences, and then I moved to the engineering team, and I started contributing directly to the identity SDKs and to the various developer tools that Microsoft has, Visual Studio, Azure, and helping people to add identity features. And then about 2.5 years ago, I decided that I wanted to try something a bit more direct, so more like startup-y. And so Eugenio and Matthias, the co-founders of Auth0, were good friends. We worked together. And I thought it was a great fit for the audience I want to touch on, which is, again, developers interested in identity. And so I've been one of their architects since then. So that's my tortuous trajectory in IAM.
So we always have the question of whether IAM found you or you found IAM. It sounds like IAM found you, which is pretty cool. And I think the story you guys are developing over at Auth0 is very interesting. But the kind of the genesis for this episode and kind of what drew us to invite you to be a guest was your Identiverse presentation. The name of it was Browser Features versus Identity Protocols, an arms race. The topic of website tracking was something that you really delved into, and without kind of giving away the answer, I'm going to put it to you. Can you give us kind of an overview of what you talked about?
Absolutely. I think this is one very relevant topic that will become more and more relevant as things move forward. And the basic idea is that there is a lot of user tracking going on because it's extremely lucrative. And it's really a powerful tool. And the way in which this tracking occurs uses some primitives offered by the browser. And those primitives are the same primitives that are used by identity protocols to manufacture the end user experience and the effects of signing in and similar. So what happens is that when browsers try to prevent tracking, they also disrupt identity protocols. And so largely the talk was an exploration, a ultra quick exploration, because I just had 20 minutes. So I had to basically wrap and speak really fast. But I just gave a flavor of the problem, a flavor of like why there are shared primitives between the two use cases, tracking and identity. And then I just presented, sprinkled around the landscape of possible solutions, because this is a problem that everyone is aware of, and everyone, browsers, identity people, and users, we are all trying to find a way forward that preserves what we have while preventing these tracking problems.
If the browsers are trying to kind of implement methods to prevent tracking, they can interfere with the way single sign-on protocols work. One of the questions I was wondering is there a difference or are there some advantages to developers using OpenID Connect or OAuth2 versus SAML in order to kind of stay a step ahead? Is one advantageous over the other?
Both universes, so the identity with SAML or the identity with OpenID Connect /auth, they have all a number of different options. Let's say that those protocols like cover multiple sub-scenarios. Depending on the scenario that you pick, you might actually avoid those problems. And typically the core of these problems is cookies. Cookies are used as a way of maintaining state in a stateless protocol and giving this state to the user agent, the browser. And if you use options that don't require the use of cookies, then you are in a good place. And it is indeed possible, like if you use the artifact binding or if you use in OpenID Connect some of the more server-side flows as opposed to front channel, you could do that. But it's not a good solution because SAML has an extraordinarily large deployment base. Like it's everywhere. And a lot of the software that powers those deployments is done, calcified. The code of that thing is lost in time. And there is just no chance for people to put their hands in there and change it. And also there are like various drawbacks, as in you can only go so far. Let's say that you can preserve the ability to sign in, but without something that the browser do, you might be unable to preserve the experience. So if today you are able to do single sign-on across multiple sites, this is predicated on your ability to maintain the fact that you are signed in with your identity provider. So that when you sign in to the second website and you go back to the identity provider, you can somewhat leverage the fact that you're already signed in. If there are some flaws that will prevent you from doing that, then your experience will be that you'll be still presented with some prompt, even if you're already signed in. So although you retain the ability to sign in, your experience is ruined. Or if, for example, if you are on one website that is doing background updates, say, I don't know, like something that has a monitoring console, which updates a list of something which you obtain by making an authenticated call to a web API. Very often, those calls are performed using short-lived tokens. And so normally we rely on the ability to refresh those tokens in the background. And if you lose that ability, then your console at a certain time will stop refreshing. And if you wanted to have that refreshed, you might need to do something interactively, which once again, it's something that it's normally below the consciousness level of a user. The refresh just happens. If we were to surface all of these, service updates that we do behind the scenes, the user experience would become truly jarring. So again, it's hard. Like this is not a problem that it can just be solved by carefully choosing a sub scenario of SAML or OpenID Connect. It's bigger than that.
Right. It seems to me that one of the main themes, I think what you just alluded to, is that cookies are the method, the physical method of how the tracking is established and ongoing. And you know, you used the fictitious example, Shampoo Bargains, as the website that was dropping this cookie, but it's not just the obscure websites, right? I mean, it's mainline e-commerce, the Amazon.coms of the world. That's how they can, you know, hit you with ads on n number of sites to say, you know, you might want a filing cabinet because they know that you were looking at filing cabinets, right? And you're thinking, how in the world did this other website know that I wanted filing cabinets?
Well, it's obvious the Facebook app is listening to you.
Yeah, it is. You sometimes do have the impression that the device is listening to you. And the thing is, the cookies are a very concrete manifestation of that. But in fact, there are a very large variety of methods that can be used for tracking. Like from, if you are on a device using Bluetooth and sensing proximity of another device, and they are both tracked or like they are both geolocated, and so you can extract information out of that. Mobile devices have identifiers that can often be used to aggregate a lot of those things. There is this technique called link decoration, which largely means that when you do a redirect, you include in the query string some information instead of like just relying on cookies. And the unfortunate thing is that some of the new techniques that browsers use for preventing tracking recognize the link decoration, and so they will take remediation actions. But if you look at all of the messages in OpenID Connect or Auth and similar, every time you do a redirect and you send a message, you use the query string for passing parameters, like the identifier of a client that is going, the address where you expect the tokens to be returned to once authentication occurred, state parameters, all sorts of parameters that by design are in there, and the browser doesn't understand that that thing is off or OpenID Connect. And so it says, you are using a decorated link, hence you are a tracker. And then at that point, once you are flagged as a tracker, your life becomes very complicated. Your cookies might be marked as you can't send them. They might expire in a shorter time without the user interacting. And so you can see how the things that I said earlier, background updates, single sign-on, and similar, can start to suffer for these kind of things.
It's interesting the way that tracking is so prevalent now, because it's such a big part of advertising, like you mentioned, right? So you've got companies like Google, who their entire business, and Alphabet, which is the parent company of Google at this point, their whole business is ads, right? They want to know as much about you as possible, your Gmail account, your Android phone, all the services you're using, et cetera. But at the same time, they've also, I think, recognized some of the issues around identity, and they've been on the forefront of some of the more recent identity trends. Things like zero trust, for example, is something that kind of came out of them as well. What do you think is the right balance between marketing and security and the user experience that is constantly getting pulled in between?
This is an extraordinarily hard problem. And to get a good background on this, one of the recommendations that I often give is there is a really good book on the topic, which is The Age of Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff, which is a difficult book. Like, it's thick and it's intense here and there, but it really does something which I believe is really important, which is it decouples the issue from the technological angle, which we as practitioners tend to look at. Like, my mission is to preserve the developer experience, the user experience, but I don't naturally gravitate toward looking at this as a societal level issue. And instead, in that book, Shoshana take a step back and say, okay, this thing is a completely new model, in which the idea is, that often you hear that if you are not paying, you are the product. And instead, her thesis is, you are not the product, you are the raw material. Let's say that when you act online and you leave your digital wake, and even offline, if people manage to actually retrieve information about your behavior. And if they manage to build a dossier about you, then they can obtain, like, what she calls, like, she has a penchant for lyrical outrage. So she introduces a lot of slogany terms, like the certainty of outcomes. Like, the more they know about you, the more the action they do will have a well-known outcome. And the most known is presenting ads, but in fact, this that is not limited to ads, as in making you buy something. Like, there is another book which also goes really well with that, which is 21 Lessons for the 21st Century by Yuval Harari, which is the same author of Sapiens, which is perhaps more known. And again, excellent book. But the main point there is AI is machine learning, all of these techniques, which are not particularly new, but that they are coming to fruition now because we have enough data and enough computational power, actually give to algorithms companies that have enough insight about you to potentially know more about yourself than you yourself do. And so this knowledge can be used to manipulate your behavior, which is not just buying something, but it could be like, if I know that you've just been through a bitter divorce and you are particularly vulnerable, they might push you in one direction or the other. Or, I don't want to get into that, but I'm sure that you read ad nauseum, Cambridge Analytica, and all this kind of behavioral manipulation, which becomes really serious, because, like, when you have so much data about people, you can really jump to conclusions and find exactly what is the message that you need to present at what time. So these attempt, like, even if it makes my own life difficult, because it breaks my SDKs, it breaks my services and forces me to update them. So I'm not crazy about it. But I find the things that the browsers are doing for trying to prevent these unwitting tracking completely justified, because the risk of these kind of data being used without the knowledge of a user, that's the important part of the consent, it's extremely high, and the consequences might be really dire. So I accept these changes as something that we've got to deal with, because it's important for everyone.
You mentioned something there that I think is really important, and I've said it before, and I'm not the inventor of it either, because you said it too. But if you're not paying for a product, you are the product, right? So all your data that's associated with it, I think that's really important, because I think people in the identity space get it, and they're starting to kind of get out there as tracking, and we've seen it most recently in American politics, where all of the data that Facebook, for example, is collecting, right? They have just wealth of information, cross-site cookies and things that they're able to track across all the different sites that you're visiting, and put together a fairly accurate picture of who you are, the type of person you are, what are your likes, dislikes. And we've seen that weaponized in the form of election interference and targeted messaging to rile up different parts of the population, those sorts of things. And I think it's really important for people to understand that this is a big deal. The problem is, because of the way the identity is currently constructed, through the use of very similar mechanisms of tracking, that there is certainly going to be issues that are going to come up when, for example, Apple in the next version of iOS and macOS is really going hard after trackers in the Safari browser. And they are, they've been, I would say, on the leadership side of privacy for their customers, for all the other things that people certainly have issues with around, App Store and walled gardens and their whole ecosystem. That seems to be an area that they have been relatively consistent in, is the privacy of the user. Things like sign in with Apple that obfuscates the email address for individuals who choose to take advantage of that. Now, what's interesting is that typically that kind of thing only works if you're in the Apple ecosystem. So, if you're a Windows, Android user, or if, you're someone like me who bounces to the latest, greatest thing, whatever that may be, you may not be able to take advantage of all that. But I sense a coming browser war and marketing war against privacy trackers and, marketing, and identity is certainly getting stuck in the middle of that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting moment. And I have to say that different actors display a different degree of openness to discuss. So, for example, you mentioned Apple. 2 years, like 3 identiverses ago, it was when Apple introduced ITP2. And by introducing ITP2, it broke an entire class of applications that back in the day, single-page applications had the guidance that you were supposed to use the implicit grant in OAuth, which was all predicated on the ability to do redirect and also to do refreshes through an iframe. So you are supposed to be able to access the cookie that says, yes, I'm authenticated, when hitting the domain of your identity provider through an iframe. And that action broke that. And so what happened was that I called a big meeting at Identiverse, and Identiverse was nice enough to give me a room and a time slot. And I got like a lot of big wigs in the identity world. Like I don't want to mention the names because some of them ended up not signing the document. But what happened was that we put together a document in which we said, dear Apple, we understand the reasons for which we are doing this, but you are breaking these important scenarios, and you might lead to even less secure mechanisms. Because one way of working around this is to use no protocol at all and just like send passwords around, which of course that would be a regression. So what happened is that we crafted with this open letter. I got a number of people to sign it, but the content was like contributed by everyone. Like think of any big company that has a stake in identity and they were in the room contributing to the discussion. We sent this thing, the web evangelists from Apple acknowledged this, saying, oh, great, absolutely, let's talk. But then it was kind of like a radio silence for a long time, until eventually we were just told, well, don't use cookies. And it was like not a fantastic experience in terms of dialogue. And then in the meanwhile, what happened was that the OAuth world actually changed the guidance and said, okay, we always told you not to use the authorization code grant, which uses cookies less than the other one, because it's too dangerous in the browser. Industry advanced enough, like in particular the adoption of a CORS protocol, is now sufficiently ubiquitous that now it's okay to use this particular grant if you use these extra measures like refresh token rotation and similar. And so what happened is that we ended up being able to apply the guidance that Apple was suggesting we should do, but by kind of like complete chance, not because they helped. Contrast this with Google, in which like Google introduced the same site, which also is very disruptive, and broke a number of different flaws, to the point that for the COVID crisis, they rolled back their deployment schedule because they were breaking a lot of people without any chance of recovery. And at the same time, there is a group of guys in Google that are working on a proposal called WebID, which is an attempt to add APIs directly in the browser to take care of identity, so that you don't end up in this problem of classifying whether this interaction is tracking or identity, because now we have an API specialized for identity. And it's early days, and the current proposal isn't complete. Like there are like various gaps and similar, especially in the business area, whereas they naturally gravitate, they naturally think first about the consumer, of course. But we are having weekly calls with them. Like they followed my presentation at Daniverse, they contributed, they commented. The OpenID Connect Foundation workshops, they showed up and made their presentation. In the OAuth security workshop in Norway, which just happened 1 month ago, they showed up and they commented. So they are super open to collaborate, and they really want to find a solution which achieves the goal to prevent tracking and preserve privacy, but at the same time doesn't throw the baby with the bathwater and preserves identity. So it's a long, steep road ahead, but their openness has been fantastic. So I am very optimistic that we'll find a good solution.
That's encouraging, because I think having them engage me part of the process is going to be very helpful, because they're obviously a behemoth, right, in the IT world and in the tech world, and even just popular culture. So the things that they're able to do and push forward things like Touch ID, Face ID, example, right, really pushing forward MFA to a level that we really hadn't seen it before then, at least not really effectively in the consumer population, is important. You mentioned one thing about COVID, and it just got me thinking around some of the apps that are being developed using the COVID tracking APIs that have been recently released for iOS and Android. And I think there is a lot of concern around how will the data that be used? Is it secure enough? There's a lot of trust that someone has to put in to be able to say, okay, I want to use that application and try to do the right thing around contact tracing and kind of help, mitigate some of the issues that are coming out of the current pandemic. Is that something that you've had any discussions with, as far as, maybe not specifically, but have you heard talk around other people talking about, like, what is the security around that? Is it safe to use between Apple and Android's approaches to it?
So I haven't looked in particular to the specific implementations of those two mobile platforms, but people I trust had good things to say about them. In particular, Steve Wilson, an analyst from Constellation Research, who is like really big expert in privacy. And I don't want to put any words in his mouth, but I believe he gave a thumbs up in a couple of tweets about it. Now I'll go double check again, just to make sure that I'm not putting words in his mouth. But I believe that he was okay with that. I think that the challenge, like I have two reflections on that. One is that the challenge is always people, as in people will try to abuse the system when possible. I remember reading in the news that in some country there was like this contact tracing requirement in which people would have to actually give their contact to the operator, like it was a pizza place. They went to grab a pizza to go, and they had to give their contacts. And then one of the employees of a pizza parlor actually stalked one lady, went there because he had her contact. And so he showed up at their door or something crazy like that. Now you can transport these into, we have a math for doing perfect, I would say, privacy preserving contactless stuff. But the thing is that the system is very fragmented. Let's say that there are many different approaches. There's a lot of politics ongoing. So some people sometimes endorse one system or the other, not out of technical merits, but more for affiliations and similar, which in turn lowers the trust of the people that normally would rely on experts to guide them on these matters. And so you end up with this patchwork of different apps that are not compatible. And also, notably absent in all of these, I believe there is this decentralized identity. Like there is this big movement on DID and similar, but ultimately, these looked like the perfect storm, the perfect application for a good privacy preserving solution, but the majority of the solutions I've seen are not based on that technology, which to me, once again, it suggests that it's more of a solution searching for a problem rather than vice versa. But that's my personal bias.
I think it's real interesting the way this conversation has gone, because one of the questions I wanted to ask was, your Identiverse presentation focused a lot on the use of tracking from a marketing perspective. And what I wanted to ask you was, are there other uses of tracking for kind of nefarious purposes? And you brought up Cambridge Analytica. And for anybody who hasn't seen The Great Hack is a documentary on Netflix, and it kind of just relives that whole and reveals what happened with Cambridge Analytica and the influence on the 2016 U.S. presidential election. I highly recommend it. Go out and spend a couple hours watching that if you're in this field. But I think, look, we all have different expectations of privacy, all the way from people who say, I have a right to privacy, which, in the United States anyway, you have a right to free speech, a right to practice whatever religion you want. You have some constitutionally mandated rights. I think sometimes people think that the right to privacy is in the Constitution. It's not. You also have other people on the other end of the spectrum who aren't concerned about their privacy as much, especially if they're able to get more services, or like Jeff brought up, the whole idea of the contact tracing, and like, yeah, that's a societal benefit of giving up your privacy. And then you have some people who fall everywhere else in between in the spectrum. I consider myself somewhere in between. But I think that Cambridge Analytica and kind of how it got exposed really soured people on, tracking and how it can be used and how companies can use it to manipulate us. And, it's one thing if you're trying to sell me a fancy file cabinet, I kind of don't care. But if you're trying to influence the way I think, the way I vote, and the way this country is going to be run, I do have an issue with that, and I don't want to be used in that way. So I guess I'm just throwing that out there. I don't know if there are other examples of kind of nefarious tracking. Originally, when I thought of the question, I started to think about, are there other nation states who are somehow trying to get data to somehow manipulate? And I would think the elections are probably, ground zero for that. But any thoughts that you're having there, Vittorio, and anything I just said?
It's a very difficult topic because it sits at the intersection of so many fundamental worldviews. Like there is the pure biological aspect in which people might not be fully on board on the idea that they can be easily manipulated. Like people might say, no, I have a free will and I have my immortal soul and I decide what I want to do. There might be more, I would say, reductionist approaches saying, well, I am a machine made of carbon instead of silicon, but I'm a machine. And so if someone knows enough, trains a good model of me, then they know what buttons to push. They know when I am vulnerable to be incepted. They know when I'm this close from exploding because I'm really upset for some reason, and they just need a little push versus, and here you already get the challenge of how do you deal with that? And then there's the political aspect. Like just yesterday, I was reading an article in which they were describing how some ideologies that are normally considered fringe, they are being normalized by Instagram. Like there are a number of Instagram accounts that talk about completely neutral stuff like homework or fashion and similar, and somehow they are smuggling some of these ideology in a way which is perfectly acceptable to an audience that you don't normally think about when you think about conspiracy theories. But then again, here, I don't want to go into the details because like everyone has a different political standing, and they might feel like they might not hear the discussion about, we are talking about the meta mechanism, they might feel their own ideology attacked. So I can't go there. And then there is all the AI aspect in general, as in, again, I go back to Harari and his 21 Lessons book. And he makes an excellent point. Like, imagine that a system would have a way of monitoring you completely, like your heart rate, perspiration, everything, while you're listening to a piece of music, like your favorite song. And imagine that this thing can see when your heart rate accelerates, when you produce a particular endorphin and similar. And now imagine that there could be an AI which optimizes for that and creates the perfect song just for you, specifically for you, based on your physiology. And then at that point, that would be like the absolute hit, because for you, it's the absolute best song that you can hear. Now, take that extreme and make it slightly less extreme and think about all the data that companies can already gather about you, and think about the things that they might want you to do, as in modify a particular belief or vote or buy something or travel somewhere or don't do something. Like, there can be all sorts of things that some actors might want you to do. And it's super hard to detect it, because it's given that when you think about machine learning, you have strong features and weak features. Strong features are the things that we as humans can see and cause an effect, in which you say, well, okay, clearly a big weight falls on my foot and my toe breaks. It's like obvious. But then there are these weak features, weak correlations that are buried in enormous piles of data. Like, when you have a lot of data, you can find these weak correlations that still have a cause and effect thing, but as humans, we can't appreciate. You find it only if you have a lot of data and if you have a big computational device that can extract it. So when you act on those things, as humans, we don't see it. Like, if you slightly change a font, if you change a color, if you change the position of something on a page, it's completely inconsequential for me. But maybe, like, again, I don't want to feed paranoia, but it's true that there are things that can be done that as humans we don't see, but they can have some effect. Then, of course, I'm not talking about at the individual level. At the individual level, we all have more latitude. But if you take a population of millions as a whole, and in aggregate, it's kind of like spam. Like, most people will not react to it, but even if few people react, the spammer makes a lot of money. So all of these things live in those spectrums, and it's super hard to detect that it's happening or where we sit on the spectrum. And I just want to clarify, all of these is not identity, as in authentication and similar. When we talk about identity, we have a very explicit ceremony in which you have an account, you have an existing relationship, you take actions for signing in and similar. All I'm talking about here is digital wake, like people acting online and somehow their wake being harvested. Like, I'm not talking at all about what happens when I do sign in someone and similar. Sorry, I rambled. I know this is a topic that finds me very passionate, so I ramble.
No, and it's such at the forefront right now of, my mind, especially because, I think one of the things that we're seeing right now is all this tracking data being used, and it kind of reminds me of, the best security is the one you don't see, right? It just kind of works in the background, kind of silently, and you kind of talked about that from, from the weak analogies there. And I see the same thing when it comes to using identity data, the digital wake as you described it, to influence. Do you even know you're being influenced, right? And that's the most powerful thing, because it throws into question, is what I'm seeing real? Is it fake? Then you start adding in other things like deep fakes from, video perspective, and now they're doing it, from an audio perspective. And, I just want that stuff to be able to do the memes, right? And to do stupid videos that we can post in our Slack channel. But that can certainly take the identity data that's being tracked around you and start to form this persona, right, to be able to move things forward. So I think it puts developers, for example, in a very precarious position, because they're stuck between what are they trying to do, and then the identity solution that they're trying to put in place or being asked to put in place, right? And it's a very tough bridge to be on sometimes, and it makes it really interesting to talk about, how would that data be secured? How is it going to be used? How is it not going to be used? How is it going to be protected? Are we hashing this? Or is someone able to, pull all this information out of a exposed S3 bucket, and then next thing you know, you've got this dossier of information on a whole bunch of different people, and you can use it for any number of reasons, right? Maybe it's just spam, maybe it's Bitcoin, like we saw with Twitter a few weeks ago when they had their issue with a bunch of accounts getting compromised. I said it then, and I'll say it again. That could have been a lot worse, right? I mean, what if someone had tweeted out something under the persona of Joe Biden saying, he's dropping out of the race, or wanted to move markets or things like that, right? I mean, there's a lot of bad things that could have happened. And I think a lot of times the development community that's actually doing the plumbing between these different applications and ideas that people have from a product perspective get stuck in the middle of it. Is that something that you've had some conversations around and have any thoughts on?
So this is a really good point to clarify. From the developer perspective, from the architectural perspective, of course, we strive to be as secure as possible and as sealed as possible. So typically when we build systems, we build systems with their own laws of physics. So if you are an employee of company X, then privacy considerations between you and your employer have a specific boundary. Like there are sets of information which are somewhat shared, like your business email is yours, but it's also your employer's. Your employee number, again, is in similar situations, and apps that your employer is using have an expectation of having access to information about you that often will occur without you consenting every time. Like when you enter in a contract, a work relationship with your employer, there are a number of things that you'll do. And the same goes when you get into applications, as in there is a terms of use that you accept. And then within the terms of use, then the identity that you explicitly deal with is part of that contract. Then in that context, of course, things need to be as secure as possible. So the thing that you bring up with Twitter, there, it wasn't as much a problem with tracing, which is more about, again, involuntary dropping a trail behind you and large scale. So it's not like spearheading one specific individual. Instead, in that case, that was a specific attack on particular people. And then it was compromising one particular system, which go well beyond harvesting information about users and then using them to position ads. And there, of course, lots and lots of discussions. Hindsight is 2020, but like the crux of this is the usual impersonation, like this feature in which an operator can act on behalf of someone like a customer and similar is an extraordinarily difficult thing to secure. And you can like here, there's the usual convenience versus security. You could ask this impersonation thing to always go through a consent step from the end user. But then that would mean that whomever operates now need to wait for this kind of a transaction to close. And so they might be unable to act very quickly. So there's like this difficult balance that needs to be achieved. But to your point, as developers, I think that our mission is to give tools for developers to build applications that are as secure by default as they can be for the correct context. Like in the same way in which I would not go to do groceries in a tank, I can go in a bicycle. A tank is more secure, but it's not justifiable the expense of a tank, the expense of finding a parking lot for a tank when a bicycle can suffice. But the point is that as security experts, as identity experts, we need to choose what's the best default, be as secure as the user can tolerate and the developer can tolerate, and then always offer options to up that security and lower that security. But it's a hard thing because the end users, but also developers, are usually not experts in identity. Like the idea is that the knowledge you need for being an identity expert is disproportionate in terms of effort in respect to the task that developers typically want to achieve. Like if I'm building an application that helps you to schedule rides or do bank transactions or fold molecules, my expertise might be about the domain that I'm trying to model. Like I might be a great bioinformatic and I know how proteins fold. So asking me to take a second PhD in identity and security is very hard, especially because once you secure the transaction, chances are that you'll just happily forget about it and just go about the real innovation that you want to achieve. And so as identity experts, and especially like people that create tools for developers, we are in this interesting position in which we should enable the developer to get the job done at the level that they want, with the knowledge that they have, by picking the right defaults and making them fall into the pit of success. As in, if they just use the defaults, they should be in a good position. But at the same time, we should provide a good graceful slope if they want to do more, or if they know more. Like if you happen to know something about OAuth and you want to choose a particular flow, you should be able to do so. You simply should not be forced to know that in advance in order to use this thing. It's kind of like if you want to wash your hands, you need to know which faucet gives you hot water or not. You normally don't need to know whether your pipes are copper or PVC or similar. But if you're using the water for some kind of chemical reaction, you might want to know what is the kind of pipe. So in your little manual, you should have the first page should be quick start. The right faucet is the one with hot water. And then you should have a bit further advanced. You want to know what kind of pipes we have in the wall? Be my guest. Here is more details so that you can gracefully allow for that. And when I say this, I'm thinking about SDKs, but in fact, this applies to services as well. In fact, like very often you see people trying to take existing products which implement the scenario that their program manager envisioned, which is a very common scenario, a very useful scenario, but very often doesn't exactly apply to your precise scenario. It's kind of like a square peg around the hole kind of thing. And so the best products normally have some leeway, some configurability thing that allow you to adapt the shape of your product to your exact situation. And there are different strategies, and of course I'm partial to the one that we use at Auth0, which is just allow you the chance to inject your own code in the last mile. So instead of taking the burden of rewriting everything yourself, we still take care of the fundamentals, creating messages, validating tokens, doing anomaly detection, protecting you from credential stuffing, all the things that require deep expertise and infrastructure. But then if at the last mile, you want to add some code which picks up your own custom parameter and does something else, we allow you to do so, so that you get the best of both worlds. Sorry, I, again, got passionate about our stuff.
No, I mean, we've, Jeff and I have been working on a project recently where we're looking at build versus buy analysis for IAM. You brought up this scenario of, you know, a developer who's focused on building business functionality, also having to build IAM functionality. So that's within a person, but within an organization, it's kind of the same thing, which is the organization wants to focus on building their product, right? Or building the technology that supports their product. And identity and access management now is, you know, our industry has come a long way, right? The tools are a lot better than they were a decade ago. But again, it's something where it's a tough case to make that you should build your own identity management infrastructure. Unless it's very simple, because of all the things that surround identity and access management. It's not just authentication and registration, but it's, you know, preventing that threatening activity that happens. It's all the other use cases, and it's these evolving standards that if you're working with an organization, with a commercial organization, a commercial product, that vendor should be moving it along. So I think that's also the importance of, selecting a vendor that is forward looking, is doing R&D and investing in their product to bring it to that you can feel confident that 5 years from now, they're going to have 5 years worth of a better product that you can leverage. But I think we are starting to get toward the end of our time. You've been very gracious with your time with us today, and I think our listeners have gotten a lot from this. In summary, I think, if you don't put identity at the center, you could end up with your identity unlocked. And so that's the transition into the discussion about your podcast Identity Unlocked. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to let our audience know what is your podcast going to focus on? Who are the types of folks that you're going to have on it, and where can they find it?
Thank you. That was a fantastic transition. Really nice. The idea behind this podcast is to make more accessible some of the things that happen in the halls of standard making institutions. Like if you participate in the standard creation process, you'll see that there are many high bandwidth conversations that are designed to build a consensus. Like say that we want to update OAuth to be a bit more modern and better reflect the scenarios that we have today, rather than the one we had 10 years ago. What happens is that there is a large number of, or not so large number of volunteers, all experts in this area, which collaborate via mail, and we also meet like 3 times a year, this year virtually, but normally we actually fly someplace and have some in-person discussion. And we try to build consensus on what to write in the specification. And it's super important because the specification becomes almost like a legalese document in which every piece of language is very dense, is polished like a pebble in the water by a lot of discussions. And it's correct, but sometimes it's impenetrable because it's really written in this very formal language. And also, a lot of times, the discussion that led to that particular piece of language get completely lost. So if you are one developer which is interested in identity, but not professionally spending time doing standards, you might lose this important context. And so once news come out, like for example, when the implicit flow fell out of favor, not flavor, what happens was that a lot of people panicked. They thought that perhaps some new vulnerability was found, and then now it was a liability to have that particular flow in production. And instead, it wasn't the case. It was more like, okay, we think times are mature for moving to something which is more secure by default, but that doesn't mean that people having that particular flow are not secure today. So that particular incident inspired me to try to brainstorm, how can we help people that are not part of this process to understand what's happening in the identity standards world, to explain the latest wave, as in things that are still being worked on, and so there are no explainers, there are no plural site classes, there is nothing that explains exactly how it goes. And I thought also I have a personal relationship with pretty much everyone in those standard bodies. And so I said, how about we reproduce the atmosphere that we have at the bar in the evening after identity hours, in which we get at the bar, we grab our drink, and we talk about the interesting thing that happened during the day, but say that together with us, there is someone who's not an identity expert. Yeah, they might be a developer, they might be a technical, but they don't know identity. And being good people, we don't want to leave them excluded. And so we try to use a language that does not necessarily entail being an identity expert, or we anchor things into practical scenarios, things that are more concrete and similar. And so basically, that's what's happening in that podcast. Like I interview every time a guest, which is an author of some specification. So we have one episode about sender constraints and Depop. We have one episode about WebAuthn. We have one episode about the best practices for security document for OAuth. We have one episode on GNAP, which is an evolution of OAuth, or in general of authorization rather than OAuth itself. So that's what we are trying to do. And it's super hard because some of these specifications really go ultra deep. And like, for example, the security BCP really nitpicks on details. And so backtracking all the way to put those things in context is difficult. So this season is a bit of an experiment. So we'll release the first episode in September, and we'll see what happens. These might be, it's going to be very advanced, but it does surface information that you don't find anywhere else. So we'll see what the audiences think.
That sounds super interesting, and I'm excited to listen to it. So where will we be able to find it? Will it be on the Auth0 website? Will it be somewhere else?
It will be on the various podcast aggregators, and there will be its own URL. And I think it will also be surfaced in the Auth0 website. And I'll get the list of links and I'll share it with you.
Great. And then that way I can put them in the show notes for this show. We're going to have a whole lot of links in this one. So you're going to want to make sure that you check out the show notes, because we'll have a link to Vittorio on LinkedIn. I have a link for both of the Identiverse presentations that you gave, browser features versus identity protocols, and arms race, which has some very good meme usage. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Then modern identity for developers 101, which is also good. So you can find those on the Identiverse virtual website and are available on demand. We talked about a couple books. So we've got The Age of Surveillance Capitalism and 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. So we'll have that. And then we'll have a link to hopefully the Identity Unlocked podcast. And definitely want to go check that out wherever you get your podcasts, just like us as well. I think it's great having more identity flavored podcasts out there. It is a relatively niche audience, right? So this is not the Joe Rogan show with millions of listeners for sure, but I think there is plenty of people in the identity space itself, and there are a lot of roles that you can play within the identity space. So it's interesting to hear how you're going to tackle it from your perspective, and looking forward to hearing more of that. And I really do super appreciate your time and being able to be so generous with us, especially on vacation as you are right now. Before we close things out, Vittorio, anything that you want to kind of close out with? Any last thoughts before we move on?
That's it. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to chat with you guys. This has been really great.
Great, appreciate it. Jim, how about you? Anything else?
No, appreciate your time, Vittorio. Thank you.
Thank you.
So with that, we're going to go ahead and close it out for this week, and we'll let Vittorio get back on with his vacation, and we'll look for his podcast sometime here in the next, hopefully soon, maybe in a week or two, and then we'll go from there. So with that, thanks everybody for listening, and stay healthy, and we'll talk with you all in the next one. You've been listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. For more episodes, visit identityatthecenter.com.